In January of 1956, a 21-year-old driver from Memphis, Tennessee, walked into a television studio to make his national debut, still largely unknown outside the South. By December of that same year, he was the most famous entertainer in America, the target of church sermons, congressional concern, and a genuine nationwide argument about what kind of country the United States was becoming. In the space of 11 months, Elvis Presley didn't just become a star. He became a referendum, a single, magnetic figure onto whom an entire generation projected its hopes for something new, and onto whom their parents projected every anxiety they carried about where American culture was headed. This is the story of 1956, the year rock and roll stopped being a regional curiosity and became the central focal point of a genuine, deeply felt generational shift, one debated in living rooms, church basements, newspaper editorial pages, and, most visibly of all, on the flickering black and white screen of the family television set. To understand why Elvis Presley produced such an explosive reaction in 1956, you have to understand what American popular culture looked like in the years immediately before he arrived. The music charts of the early 1950s were still dominated substantially by smooth, orchestrated pop vocalists, performers whose stage presence was polished, restrained, and, crucially to the anxieties that would soon follow, entirely unthreatening to the sensibilities of an adult audience raised on big band swing and Tin Pan Alley songwriting. Beneath that polished mainstream surface, however, something considerably rawer and more electric had been building for years in black rhythm and blues recordings and in the country and gospel music of the rural South. Genres largely segregated from mainstream white radio airplay by the informal but deeply entrenched racial boundaries of the American recording and broadcasting industry. Elvis Presley, a white teenager who had grown up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, and then Memphis, absorbed all of these traditions simultaneously. The gospel music of his church upbringing, the blues and rhythm and blues he heard on Memphis's black radio stations and in its clubs, and the country music of his own family's musical heritage, and fused them into something that record producer Sam Phillips at Sun Records had reportedly been searching for specifically. A white performer who could authentically channel the raw, physical energy of black musical traditions in a way mainstream white America might actually embrace. Presley's earliest Sun Records singles, released beginning in 1954, built him a substantial regional following across the South, but it was his move to the major label RCA Victor at the very end of 1955 that set the stage for the explosive national breakthrough to come. In January of 1956, RCA released Heartbreak Hotel, and the song's success was immediate and, for a performer largely unknown outside a handful of southern states just months earlier, genuinely startling, climbing to the top of the national charts and establishing Presley, almost overnight, as a legitimate contender for the kind of mainstream stardom that had, until that point, seemed entirely unavailable to a performer working in this raw, hybrid style. Television, still a relatively young medium finding its footing as the dominant form of American mass entertainment, became the primary arena on which the coming controversy would actually play out, because television did something radio alone never could. It let the entire country see, rather than simply hear, exactly how Elvis Presley moved while he performed. His earliest national television appearances came on the Dorsey Brothers program, Stage Show, beginning in January of 1956, a comparatively low-key introduction that nonetheless steadily built his national profile across a series of appearances that winter. But it was a pair of appearances later that spring on The Milton Berle Show that transformed Presley from a rising musical star into the center of a genuine national debate. Presley's first Burley appearance, on April 3, 1956, performed on the flight deck of the USS Hancock in San Diego, before an audience of cheering sailors, drew considerable attention. But it was his second appearance on the program, broadcast on June 5, 1956, that ignited the controversy that would define the entire remainder of the year. Performing his latest single, Hound Dog, Presley extended the song's closing verses into a slowed-down, exaggerated performance built around increasingly emphatic hip movements, a performance that sent the teenage girls in Burrell's studio audience into audible screams and sent a considerable portion of the American press and a significant number of American parents into something close to outright alarm. Newspaper columnists across the country condemned the performance in strikingly similar language, describing it as vulgar, suggestive, and entirely unfit for a family entertainment medium, still finding its own standards for acceptable content. Critics began referring to Presley in the newly coined and instantly viral nickname of the moment, as Elvis the Pelvis, a label meant as mockery, but one that, in its own way, only further cemented his name in the center of the national conversation. The scale and speed of the backlash that followed this single television performance is worth sitting with, because it illustrates just how quickly a single, brief moment of televised entertainment could develop into a genuine national controversy in 1956 America. Parent-teacher associations across the country issued formal statements condemning both the performance and the broader genre it represented. Religious leaders across a range of denominations delivered sermons specifically addressing Presley's performance style as evidence of declining moral standards among American youth. In one particularly striking example of just how far this anxiety traveled, a Catholic diocese in La Crosse, Wisconsin, reportedly contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation directly, raising concerns about Presley as a potential threat to American values. A request that speaks volumes about the genuine, if today almost difficult to fully credit, scale of adult anxiety this young performer had managed to provoke in the space of a single network television broadcast. That anxiety produced an almost immediate ripple effect across the television industry itself, most memorably in Presley's next major national appearance on The Steve Allen Show on July 1, 1956. Allen, competing directly against the far more established Ed Sullivan Show in the same Sunday evening time slot, booked Presley specifically to capitalize on the controversy the Burrell appearance had generated, but sought to diffuse that same controversy by presenting Presley in a considerably more restrained format. Rather than allowing Presley to perform Hound Dog in his usual style, Allen had him dressed in a formal tuxedo and staged the song as a comedic novelty number, sung directly to an actual basset hound wearing a small top hat. Presley reportedly found the entire arrangement humiliating, a sentiment his later wife Priscilla would go on to describe in similarly blunt terms. But from a pure ratings perspective, the strategy worked spectacularly for Allen, with his broadcast that evening decisively beating Sullivan's own program in the ratings for the first time. That single ratings victory produced one of the more amusing footnotes of the entire saga. Ed Sullivan, who had previously and publicly stated he had no intention of ever booking Presley on his own program, precisely because he wanted no part of the controversy surrounding the young performer, sent Steve Allen a brief, sarcastic telegram following that ratings defeat, addressing him as Stephen Presley Allen and signing off with mock affection. By the very next morning, however, sentiment and business calculation had evidently shifted considerably, and word quickly spread that Sullivan had reversed his position entirely, moving to book Presley for not one, but 3 separate appearances on his own program that year, ultimately paying an unprecedented $50,000 for the full arrangement. At the time, the largest sum ever paid to a single performer for a television booking, a clear signal that whatever moral reservations Sullivan and his producers held about Presley's performance style, the sheer commercial power of his popularity had become simply too significant for any competing network to ignore. If you appreciate this kind of deep, well-sourced look into the cultural history behind moments we mostly remember today as simple nostalgia. Subscribing genuinely helps us continue doing that kind of research. Presley's actual Ed Sullivan Show debut, broadcast on September 9, 1956, became one of the single most watched television broadcasts in the medium's still young history, drawing an audience estimated at around 82% of the entire American television viewing public that evening. A genuinely staggering figure that reflects both Presley's own drawing power and the fact that, in an era before cable or significant channel competition, a broadcast of this magnitude functioned as something close to a shared, unifying national event, regardless of whether individual viewers tuned in out of genuine enthusiasm or simple curiosity about exactly what all the fuss was about. The controversy surrounding Presley's performance style had, if anything, only grown by the time of his third and final Sullivan appearance that following January, and CBS's own producers, having reportedly received tens of thousands of letters of complaint following the earlier broadcasts, made the now legendary decision to film Presley only from the waist upward for that final performance. A piece of deliberate television censorship that has since become one of the most frequently cited symbols of the entire era's anxiety over Presley's physicality. It's important, in any honest account of this controversy, to look directly at what actually sat underneath so much of this adult anxiety. Because the concern over Presley's hip movements, real as that specific reaction certainly was, existed within a considerably broader and, in significant respects, more troubling set of cultural anxieties that had been building across American society for several years before Presley himself ever appeared on a national stage. The early to mid-1950s had already produced a substantial public focus over what commentators of the era broadly termed juvenile delinquency, a concern fueled by films like Blackboard Jungle and Rebel Without a Cause, both released in 1955, and further amplified by psychiatrist Frederick Wertham's widely discussed 1954 book, arguing that popular entertainment, comic books especially, was actively corrupting the character of American youth. A Senate subcommittee chaired by Senator Estes Kefauver had already held televised hearings across 1954 and 1955, examining precisely this supposed link between mass entertainment and rising youth crime. And by the time Elvis Presley's television appearances began generating national headlines in the spring of 1956, an entire generation of American parents, clergy, and public officials had already been primed, by several years of near-continuous public discourse, to view any new, youth-embraced cultural phenomenon through a lens of genuine alarm. There was, additionally, a racial dimension running directly beneath much of this cultural reaction, one considerably more serious in its real-world consequences than the mockery directed at Presley's dance moves, and one that deserves to be stated plainly rather than glossed over. Rock and roll's musical roots lay substantially in black rhythm and blues and gospel traditions, and its rapid embrace by white teenagers across the country represented, to a small but genuinely organized segment of the population, a direct challenge to the rigid racial boundaries still enforced across much of the American South during this period. In March of 1956, Asa Carter, a prominent Alabama segregationist leader, publicly claimed that civil rights organizations were using rock and roll music specifically to draw white teenagers toward what he termed immoral influence from black performers, and called explicitly for jukebox operators to remove every recording by black artists from circulation. That same organized hostility turned physical on the night of April 10, 1956, when members of a segregationist group stormed the stage at the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium and confronted the singer Nat King Cole while he performed before a predominantly white audience, an event that made national headlines and exposed, with considerable clarity, just how much of the broader adult anxiety surrounding rock and roll in 1956 was tangled up with anxieties about racial integration specifically, alongside the more frequently discussed concerns over sexuality and delinquency. Elvis Presley himself occupied a genuinely complicated position within this broader racial dimension of the controversy. As a white performer whose style and musical influences were unmistakably rooted in Black artistic traditions, his enormous mainstream success functioned, whether he ever framed it in these explicit terms himself or not, as a significant vehicle for introducing millions of white American teenagers to musical forms and rhythmic sensibilities that segregated radio and retail structures had previously kept largely separated by race. This dynamic drew its own considerable criticism from multiple directions simultaneously, with some contemporary voices arguing that a white performer was being credited and paid for popularizing musical innovations that Black artists had originated years earlier without receiving anything close to comparable mainstream recognition or financial reward, a critique of Presley's career and legacy that has continued in various forms among historians and music critics for decades since. Despite the sheer intensity of the adult backlash unfolding across newspapers, church pulpits, and municipal council chambers throughout 1956, that backlash accomplished remarkably little in actually slowing Presley's ascent, and in certain respects, appears to have accelerated it considerably. Teenagers, then, as in any subsequent generation, often found a piece of culture considerably more compelling precisely because their parents so visibly and vocally disapproved of it, and Presley's overwhelming commercial success throughout that year, chart-topping singles, a Hollywood film contract, and television ratings that dwarfed nearly every competing program on the air, demonstrated with striking clarity that youth culture in America had begun to develop a kind of independent commercial and cultural power that existing adult institutions, however loudly they objected, simply could not fully contain or suppress. This points to something genuinely significant happening beneath the surface of the Presley controversy specifically, a broader structural shift in post-war American society that made a phenomenon of this scale possible in the first place. The rapid economic growth of the post-war years had produced, for the first time in American history, a genuinely substantial population of teenagers with meaningful independent spending power of their own, allowance money, part-time job earnings, and a media landscape, television chief among it, increasingly organized around marketing directly to that specific demographic rather than exclusively to their parents. Combined with the psychological aftershocks of the Second World War and the early Cold War, a cultural moment defined by considerable anxiety over conformity, moral discipline, and the stability of the traditional American family, the arrival of a genuinely new, teenager-driven form of mass culture, one that openly celebrated physical spontaneity and emotional expression over the restrained formality so many parents had been raised to value, was almost certain to provoke exactly the kind of generational debate that played out so visibly across 1956. By the end of that year, the shape of the dynamic and its eventual resolution had become reasonably clear, even if genuine cultural anxiety over rock and roll would continue simmering in various forms for years afterward. Elvis Presley closed out 1956 as, by any reasonable commercial measure, the single biggest entertainer in the United States, having transformed himself over the course of just 11 months from a regional Southern performer into a certified national phenomenon, one whose Hollywood film career was already underway and whose record sales had made him an entirely new kind of commercial force in American entertainment. The adult institutions that had spent that same year criticizing him, newspaper editorial boards, parent-teacher associations, religious leaders, and even, briefly, federal law enforcement, had not managed to meaningfully slow that ascent, and in several well-documented instances, most notably Ed Sullivan's own dramatic and rapid reversal, had instead found themselves forced to accommodate the very cultural force they had initially sought to resist, recognizing, whether they fully admitted it publicly or not, that the sheer commercial and cultural momentum building behind rock and roll, and behind Presley specifically, had already grown too large to simply be wished away through moral condemnation alone. What 1956 ultimately revealed, with a clarity that would go on to repeat itself in various forms across subsequent decades of American popular culture, was that a genuine generational divide had opened, one running along lines of sexuality, race, religious authority, and fundamental questions about what forms of expression a mass entertainment medium ought to be permitted to broadcast into the American living room. Elvis Presley did not create that divide by himself, and the deeper anxieties over juvenile delinquency, racial integration, and shifting moral standards that fueled so much of the adult reaction to him had, in most respects, already been building for years before his own national breakthrough. But he became, through a combination of genuine musical talent, magnetic screen presence, and a series of televised performances that happened to land at precisely the right, or precisely the wrong, cultural moment, the single most visible focal point around which an entire society's uncertainty about its own rapidly changing future came, however briefly, into sharp and unmistakable focus. If this deeper look at exactly why 1956 became such a genuine cultural flashpoint gave you a new appreciation for the year that made Elvis a legend, share this video with someone who'd enjoy discovering the real, more complicated history behind the nostalgia.